And it is now time to bring in the Housing Minister in the Albanese government, Clare O'Neil. Clare, welcome back to News Breakfast.
Morning, James. How are you guys?
Really good, thank you. There's a bit I want to get through this morning, but I want to start overseas. Benjamin Netanyahu has called Anthony Albanese a weak leader. Do you care at all what he thinks?
Well, these are really disappointing comments, James, and this kind of diplomacy just doesn't work. And the Australian government's certainly not going to engage in an unseemly tit-for-tat with an elected leader on the other side of the world. One thing that I think Australians understand about Anthony Albanese is that the way he conducts himself on the global stage is respectful, well-mannered, but also very robust. We've taken a strong position on what's going on in the Middle East, and that's because this is an issue that many Australians feel very strongly about. People are watching from afar, but seeing many innocent people lose their lives, and in particular, children who are being subjected to forced starvation and violence in a war in which they have no blame and no part. And our government is moving ahead in concert with other countries to try to find a lasting solution to that problem.
We've spoken a lot about this, I think, including with other ministers, but also you on this program. It was interesting, I thought, overnight to hear Mr Netanyahu's domestic political opponents say that this was a gift for Anthony Albanese. Do you see it as a gift? Is Benjamin Netanyahu that toxic now?
Oh, look, James, to be honest with you, it is, it's not the central issue here. I noticed that Benjamin Netanyahu's made similarly inappropriate comments about world leaders in Canada and the UK and France, and this is the way that he does his business as the leader of Israel. That's his right. It's just not our focus. Our attention is on making sure that Australia does what it does best on the global stage, and that is act for peace and justice. But also, James, you know, really keeping that attention and focus on the impacts here in Australia. I represent a really multicultural community, and a lot of people who I represent came to Australia because they didn't want to be a part of conflicts like what's going on in the Middle East, and we need to make a lot of effort to make sure that we don't import the kind of violence and negativity that's associated with this. So those are our areas of focus, and Benjamin Netanyahu can say what he needs to say.
Do you think your government still shares the same values as Israel's government?
Oh, look, I might leave that question for Penny Wong, James. I think the main focus for us is making sure that we act in Australia's national interest in relation to Israel, as in all world affairs, and I think you've seen the government do that, and Anthony Albanese do it, using that really polite and respectful and strong approach that he takes to global matters.
All right, that is well outside your portfolio, so but thank you for being a good sport and answering my questions on that. I do want to take you to Australia's housing crisis. We can bring up this graphic. This is the median price for houses and units in our capital cities at the moment. We might not have the graphics, but there you go. This is a combination of units and houses. Sydney, 1.2 million, Melbourne, 800,000, Brisbane, well over 900,000. Is it just too hard now for young people to be realistically thinking about buying a home?
Well, James, that's what young people around the country tell me every single day. And I don't just hear it, by the way, from young people. We've got a generation of kids growing up in our country who can see very plainly that they don't have the same housing opportunities as their parents and grandparents. I've got people in my community who are parents in their 40s who are renting and being moved from property to property. A generation or two ago in Australia, they would absolutely have owned their own home. And of course, James, we see it in our suburbs and regions around the country where there is an obvious rise in homelessness that's happening before our very eyes. These are the reasons why our government is the first government since the post-war period to seriously sit up and say we've got a national housing crisis on our hands and we're going to tackle that from every angle. So $43 billion, we're building more homes, we're getting renters a better deal, and we're getting more Australians into home ownership.
If we come back in 2.5 years ahead of the next election and we look at that graphic again and home prices have soared by another 10% or at least well in excess of inflation, is that something we can judge you on? Are you going to judge how you succeed, boosting supply, things like that, on how much house prices are going to go up?
Look, James, this has been a crisis that's been 40 years in the making, and I mean that very genuinely. This is, 40 years ago, I can find Australian politicians starting to talk about the idea of a housing crisis in our country and the idea of a generation that's being left behind. You know, you and I are about the same age. This was something that very much preoccupied us when we were in our early 20s. I remember sitting around share house tables and thinking that I would never be able to get my own home. So I just make the point, these are really long-running issues in our country, and they reflect the fact that we have a housing market that isn't functioning correctly. Now, if I can take you back to today's events, we've got the Economic Reform Roundtable here today in Canberra. Housing is going to be if not the central focus of the conversation. We've got a 40-year-old crisis because for that period of time, our country hasn't been building enough homes. And this productivity issue may seem and hear a little bit, sound a little bit remote to people watching at home. This is really about how can we build homes faster, more quickly, because more housing means more affordable housing for Australians.
We've spoken a lot about boosting supply and, there are questions whether or not you can hit your housing target of 1.2 million homes. Treasury says you might not, but you've insisted that you will. Are you going to do anything on the other side of the equation? Because the housing market is driven by supply and demand. Are you going to do anything to dampen demand for housing?
Well, there's no question that the principal problem that we confront today in Australia is that we have a housing shortage, James. For all the complexities with what's going on in the housing market, the reason for all of the problems that I listed at the beginning of our interview is that for 40 years we haven't been building enough homes, and we have today an old-fashioned housing shortage in our country that can only be repaired by building homes faster than we ever have before and doing it over a sustained period of time. So I understand your questions about that demand side, but really please hear from me. The big problem that we have as a country is a supply side problem, and that's why most of the $43 billion of investments that our government is making is about building more homes.
You have a bit of control over the demand side, though. A lot of very generous tax concessions go to property investors. Why is the Albanese government so wedded to things like negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount?
Well, we don't have plans to change those taxes, James, and that's because it's not the main game. I understand that...
Is it just too politically difficult? Are you worried there'll be a backlash from landlords? Like, what is it that you won't even have a debate on this?
Because, James, the main game here is a supply problem. I'm not making this up. This is the absolute facts show us that the reason that we have a housing crisis is not because of tax arrangements that are made here in Australia. It's because for 40 years we haven't been building enough homes. Now, that's why our government's actually stood up. We are not only replenishing this diminishing stock of public and social housing, which is critically important for our country, but we're actually rolling up our sleeves and getting involved in the problems that are besetting the mainstream market here in Australia. We've got really good research and evidence that tells us why we're not building the homes that we need and why these problems are so long running. Our attention and focus is on addressing those problems, because the more housing we have in Australia, the more affordable housing is for the next generation and for our citizens.
Just before I let you go, I'll take you back to one of my earlier questions. Ahead of the next election, you will have been in government for 6 years. If housing prices continue to soar, will you have failed?
Well, that's not the way that I would look at it, James. I think we've had, perpetual house price growth in Australia over, not just the last 4 decades, but many beyond that. The thing I'm focused on is how can we create a situation where a younger generation of Australians sees the capacity for themselves in the housing to get into home ownership. And if I can just point you to a few things from the last term, I'm not joking around here. We went through a period of 9 years of total neglect of housing. As your viewers know, the former government didn't have a housing minister for most of their time in office. From those ashes, we have built the boldest and most ambitious housing agenda for a Commonwealth government since the post-war period. In that time, 500,000 homes have been built. We've helped 175,000 young people get into their first home with our government's backing. 1 million Australians have gotten a 45% increase in Commonwealth rent assistance, and we've got 28,000 social and affordable homes in construction or planning right now. If I can just help you viewers understand the magnitude of that. We're building 55,000 social and affordable homes over a 5-year period. The Coalition in 9 years built 373. Now, I say that not to point the finger and blame the problem on them, but just so your viewers can understand the scope of what is on foot here. We're making a massive transformation in the way that government engages with housing, but it's hard yakka and a long-term problem, and we're just going to keep at it.
All right, Clare O'Neil, we'll have to leave it there. No doubt we'll discuss this many, many more times before the next election anyway. We appreciate your time this morning.
All right, thanks so much.